Aloha! Welcome back to the Anxiety Coaches Podcast. I'm your host and coach, Gina Ryan, and I'm so happy to be with you again today as we consider the many ways to bring your mind and body back to its natural peace and calm. Welcome back to part 2 of our incredible conversation with T.J. Power, the lead neuroscientist at the Dose Lab and author of The Dose Effect. If you missed part 1, I highly recommend listening to our last episode. You won't regret it. Today, we're picking up right where we left off. Get ready for even more insights and actionable takeaways from TJ as we continue this fantastic discussion. And now, because dopamine is the big neurotransmitter of the day, I will say, years ago it was serotonin, and now we are at dopamine. But again, oxytocin being a very important one. Again, I will date myself. When I had my first child in the hospital in the early 80s, they would give us oxytocin, nasal oxytocin. Yeah. So I don't know if they were experimenting on us or what, but it was obviously they wanted mothers to bond well with their babies. And as I guess some mothers have difficulty with that. But let's run through some of the other neurotransmitters that you talk about, or neurochemicals, and just give us a little brief idea of how important they are in our life and where they affect us. Because, like I said, everybody's kind of hooked on dopamine right now. But it seems to me, after looking at your book, if anything is out of balance, it really is an issue in our lives.
Definitely. And I think this oxytocin chemical particularly is fascinating in the conversation of anxiety. I think we're now living in a society that's effectively very dopamine driven. People are very in the pursuit of success, money, pleasure, drugs, partying, alcohol, social media. There's a lot of pursuit of like, how can I make my brain feel as pleasured as possible? And once upon a time, oxytocin being the chemical that's all about connection and is my group okay? And are my group surviving? And how am I contributing to my close-knit group around me? That chemical has gone on the downfall effectively as a result of us being more in the slightly, and not in a judgmental way, but selfish pursuit of how do I make myself feel really good with dopamine. Oxytocin, as you rightly shared, is this chemical that initially really surges through a mum and a baby as they're born. So the baby gets this big surge of oxytocin, which creates an instinctive desire to seek for love from that mum and the dad or the siblings that are around them. Breastfeeding and all the physical touch right at the beginning is very important there. And with oxytocin, it's very important that we have very close-knit, connected relationships. And whilst it seems amazing that we've got phones that can like call one another and we can see lots of humans on all our phones and stuff, we're actually more lonely and isolated than ever before, really, as a species now. And as a result, these oxytocin levels are low. And for a young baby, if a young baby was lying in a cot and they couldn't hear their parents' voice for a number of hours, and they didn't have their parents come over to them and hug them or cuddle them for a number of hours, very rapidly that baby would get into a deep state of fear because it can't protect itself, and oxytocin levels would be dropping rapidly. And therefore it would experience anxiety as a young little baby, thinking, where the hell is that love that I need to keep me safe? And as a result, when our oxytocin levels drop as people, if we're lonely, which is very common, or if our relationships aren't strong, and if we're not having moments of physical touch, that can be in a romantic way, but also just physical touch with a pet or a human or a grandkid, whoever it might be. If we're not having deep moments of connection, oxytocin levels fall. And as a result, our brain and body feels very fearful, wondering where that next level of connection is coming from.
Wow, that's very important for the anxiety piece. Yes.
It is. It's really massive. And I think oxytocin is really being kind of left behind in this like chemical conversation effectively. And oxytocin is the chemical that can make us feel love. And arguably, like, there's no greater pursuit as human beings than love, like your love for your kids or your partner, or whatever it may be. Really, oxytocin should be the main chemical society is chasing. But we've kind of shifted towards more of a dopamine-y world.
We haven't kind of shifted. I would say that's totally shifted. Yeah.
Yeah. It has massively. And everything about the phone, for example, is disrupting this. Like when people are in their homes with their families at Christmas, for example, the holiday season's coming up. It's fascinating. When I've got so far into this research, I now, not in a judgmental way, but I observe all my family and like the kids in my families and everyone with technology, because I'm just so passionate and so curious about what is happening here and why so many people in pain and struggling with things like anxiety. And if you look with this idea of oxytocin being the connection between humans, if you look at how much the phone is disrupting the opportunity for oxytocin, it's massive. It's very significant, and creating a real prioritization in your mind every day of how am I going to really bond with humans today is a massive, massive solution.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so glad that you in the book have covered each one thoroughly. It's not, dopamine was not the king. So
no, dopamine is not the king. It's just the current pursuit. There's even very interesting stuff for people that may live like slightly more isolated lives, where now we're kind of texting people a lot and stuff like that. There's even this fascinating research study. I made a video about this yesterday, which is in the book, which basically found that when two humans are texting one another on their phone, no oxytocin releases in their brain at all. And as soon as those two humans call one another and they hear one another's voice, oxytocin begins to release. And even something as simple as the sound of voice is literally required for oxytocin to function. And if your life is a lot of the time kind of sitting, maybe more isolated, texting on WhatsApp group chats and so on, it's very important that you kind of reduce the texting and move towards a life whereby for 10 minutes a day, you FaceTime your kid or your wife or your parent or whoever it might be that you're trying to bond with. Because obviously the ultimate goal would be see them in person, hug them, listen to them, ask them good questions, like really bond with them. But if it's going to be via tech, we need to hear their voice as well.
That was going to be the question I was going to ask, because I wondered, babies can hear a parent's voice, right? So, and that must be something very tender and special and maybe chemically changing them also. And so I wondered if phone, or such as we are doing now on Zoom, was a step up from texting or from no contact, because I think the voice is very powerful, right? So yeah, let's get out there and maybe not text, maybe make a call once in a while instead, because we're moving so far away. Now, no one wants a call anymore.
I know, because we're too busy getting our dopamine off scrolling the phone. So we're not getting because the problem is dopamine is it rapidly makes us feel good. So it's like I immediately, I could come off this Zoom and I could go on my phone, see all my Instagram, rapidly feel good. Or I could go and sit with my girlfriend and connect with her and ask her how her day's gone. And that would also make me feel good, but not very, very quickly. And we're living in a world whereby we're seeking I want to feel good really, really fast. And oxytocin is like a slower pursuit. It's like spending time connecting, asking someone how they're doing, asking intriguing, interesting questions. And the more actively you listen, the more eye contact you make, these kind of things make a massive difference to the stimulation of that chemical.
Oh, beautiful. Good. Any other words on oxytocin? We seem to be moving through the acronym here. So
I would say one of the most fundamental components of it, there's this brilliant scientist called Algo that looked at what we call the neurobiology of pro-social behavior, which is anytime you're doing something that's altruistic to other people, anytime you're giving. And we know as a species, when you give, when you do nice things, it feels good. It's nice to serve others. And from a neurobiological point of view, it's oxytocin that's creating that feeling of reward of oh, it was nice when I did that nice thing for somebody else. And if you are someone struggling with anxiety, sometimes you can get very lost in your own mind, in your own thoughts. And one of the best ways to get out of your own mind is to effectively get into someone else's and help them with something and get out of your own way for a short period of time so your thoughts can rest. And every single day, whenever there's an opportunity where you can be of service, I think it's great to do so. There's even this brilliant psychologist from Yale University called Gillian Sandstrom. She looked at something called fleeting connections. Fleeting connections is where if you're walking your dog and you smile at the person and you say good morning, or if you're in a coffee shop and you ask the barista, how's your day going? Having moments of connection with people you don't know also creates a really positive effect on your experience as a human being. And it's just very important to drive the idea of how am I contributing, how am I connecting every day, because it's something humans are reducing and not even realizing we're doing so.
Yeah, and we are reducing that. That seems very important to me. I live alone and my children are not here with me on this island. So I find that I have little interactions that are just delightful. Like, I have a
Nice.
favorite coffee shop, and they're not my best friends. They're not people I see anywhere else except at this one spot. But there's this lovely light connection where you can just tell people are being kind, you're having a human interaction. But I also see at the larger coffee shop, I won't name any names, that's big, sort of a standard one. People order ahead of time on their phone. They
Yeah.
run in and grab it and run out. And I thought about that the other day and I said, that would take away so much from my day because I have a lovely, light, very light, but very human interaction. There's always a little laugh and a smile, or if somebody's not well, they can share that moment with you. I don't know. I think, do you see this in your research that we're moving even further away from human connection?
Definitely. And all those little moments that you have, they're adding up and they're generating like this system to work within your brain and body. And that's why you want to experience them. And I see exactly that. Like people come into the coffee shop, they're looking down at their phone the whole time. They basically look down at it even whilst they order. They just say, "Can I have a coffee?" They basically pretend it's not even a human that's there. And it just means we're going through a lot of our life with no oxytocin increases. And it makes our body very anxious if it's not getting hold of this chemical. And I make a real effort to do so. Like I also work from home. My girlfriend at the moment is in Sydney, so she's quite far away from me, about 30 hours away from me. And if I sit in this office all day, like I will get lonely and I'll notice it makes my brain feel more worried or more down. And I'll make a real effort to, when I'm in the supermarket, just like ask the person that's serving me and actually go to the one where they serve you instead of always going to the one where you serve yourself. That's another example of this. And I'll always make an effort to say like, "Oh, how you doing?" And it's not like a big thing that like changed my life, but the knock-on effect of regularly doing it means you're experiencing oxytocin more. And yeah, I mean, the digital world is really creating a lot of loneliness within this experience.
Yes. And so if we start adding these things together, the seeking of the dopamine, not building our oxytocin, I mean, you start to see this can be really big problems, really being off kilter. How about serotonin? Let's look at the S and see what you got there.
Yeah, so serotonin is fascinating. 90% of the serotonin is manufactured in our gut, in our stomach, which is very different. And we have a brilliant system called our vagus nerve, which is connecting the brain and body together. It's assessing the amount of serotonin that's in the gut and it's feeding that information to our brain. And we know how involved, particularly people that may struggle with these kind of challenges, we know how much it's a full body experience when you're not feeling your best. Like you feel nervous within your body, you feel challenges within your heart and your stomach and so on. And with this serotonin chemical, it's very much to do with making sure our body is being nourished and treated as well as it possibly can in order to make sure that it's functioning well. If our body is functioning well, it will then receive that information via the vagus nerve and send it to the brain. And for lots of us, when we're feeling anxious, we think this is just something happening in our brain because it's so apparent in our thoughts. But really, a lot of the fear is taking place within the body. Making our body healthier and more nourished is the key with that chemical.
Beautiful. And I know you have a lot in the book about that for people to do.
Yeah. And I can give you a few examples for sure.
That would be great. Yeah.
I would say that the first one that's most apparent is quantity of sunlight we experience per day. There was a fantastic study in the UK of over 80,000 people measuring a variety of factors that impact mental health. They saw lack of exposure to sunlight as the number one factor that was negatively impacting mental health. And that seems so basic. It's like, oh yeah, we have to go outside, but we do have to go outside. A lot of this stuff actually is quite basic. We have to talk to humans and put our phone down and go outside, but these are things humans are not doing and therefore we are suffering. And particularly sunlight in the morning is extremely, extremely good for this system. So if you could, for example, have a rule in your mind whereby you have to see sunlight before you see social media each day. That would be like a perfect rule whereby, in order to be allowed to go on your phone and see that whole chaotic world, you have to have gone outside first. That would be a really good approach to have. Other factors that will impact it: if you can be in sunlight and then it also be in nature. Nature is incredible for this chemical. There's this brilliant scientist called Jin Park in Japan that researched forests and their impact on this chemical. When we're in a forest, this chemical is very, very high functioning. And unsurprisingly, again, because our body is like, oh, this is my home. This is where I spent 300,000 years growing up. So it settles the nervous system. So I'd say sunlight, forest, and then anytime good nutrients are coming into our body. So anytime we're eating the fruits and the vegetables and the nuts and the meats and so on, the good nutrients feed that serotonin chemical and help it flourish.
Beautiful. That's wonderful. Again, like I said, serotonin was hot for a while, but it wasn't hot in the right way because it was all drug related. And there is so much that we can do for our own serotonin levels without being involved in drugs, and always start there first. Yeah.
Definitely, there's no harm in getting sunlight and nature and eating good food. So definitely good to do those things. Get good sleep is also a factor. Those are a great place to start. If the medication is also useful to assist you, then that's a cool approach.
Absolutely. But it is something that's intrinsic to us. So, we can always investigate that first. So thank you for the serotonin piece. And let's end up here with the endorphins.
Yeah, endorphins are really fascinating. They're a chemical I feel like humans have some understanding of. A lot of people immediately think about exercise when you hear endorphins. It's often the thing that comes to mind. And that is correct. Exercise is a big factor here. It's really interesting when you look at how they evolutionarily develop within us. The only really significant stress and anxiety and fear we would have experienced as a human being back as we were evolving was very related to either lack of resources regarding food, that would have been a very scary experience, or physical danger from an animal or a human that wanted to harm us in some way. Those were the two main sources of fear within us as a species. We obviously didn't have checking your bank account and looking at the news and all this other stuff that creates fear now. We had just those two sources. And the big thing to understand is originally as we evolved, those two sources of fear were always accompanied by physical action. If it was hunger, we had to take physical action in order to solve it. Or if we were in physical danger, we had to take physical action. And in those moments, it was very useful if we had a chemical that would effectively de-stress and calm our thought process so that we weren't running along thinking, oh, I'm going to die of starvation, but we're running along in a calmer state of mind, thinking in a very focused way, how am I going to source food or escape from this threat? And it's very clear that in this modern world, we're not necessarily physically pushing our body as much as maybe we once did. Even aside from hunter-gatherers, even if you just went back 50 years or 100 years, life was a much, much more physical experience. Jobs were much more physical. Life wasn't sit at a desk and work behind a computer all day. Only with the advent of typewriters did that real seated lifestyle begin. And anytime we're physically moving our body, we're building endorphins, and they're here to calm our mind down effectively. So having a really conscious idea in your mind of how frequently am I walking or stretching, or if you can do any kind of additional exercise, swimming or cycling, anything like that, it's very important to pair together the idea of exercise and physical action itself can activate endorphins, and they're designed to de-stress your mind.
Yeah, they do de-stress your mind too. I'd never put this together before, but I noticed the few times I lived here that I had to evacuate for a tsunami. I used to live down very close to the ocean in a beach community, and you hear that alarm go off. It's very frightening. The police are out there saying you have to evacuate. So the fear is set off. But the interesting thing is, so much action was required for me to get out of danger, pack the car up, figure out where to go up the mountain, that there wasn't this residual. I would have thought, boy, that's enough to send you back to anxiety, Gina. That'll set you right off. But it didn't. And I'm feeling it had to be because I actually had to do something. I didn't have to just think about it. I couldn't just lay there. So the things weren't just running through my body. I had to get up and move. And the endorphins were my friend. They saved me. They
And they would
de-stressed
literally
me.
have been like a physical chemical within your body that as the cortisol and the stress hormones were all firing and stuff and creating fear in that moment, they were there calming all of those, like effectively putting the fires out in order to make sure you could survive. And a lot of the time now, we're in such safety as humans. We know we have food and we know we have shelter if we're fortunate enough to have that. And as a result, we can just sit in the presence of our anxiety and not take action necessarily. And this is why like it is so good if you could in an anxious state like go and hike or do things like that occasionally. You get so many of these chemicals back into balance. If you were to hike with someone, for example, and do some kind of challenging exercise for you, you would be off your phone, you'd be connecting with a human being, you'd be out in nature getting sunlight and physically pushing your body. And these kind of experiences like hikes in pairs in nature, like we really need these basic things. And obviously when you describe that hiking in nature with a friend without a phone, that's just what we did for 300,000 years. We just hiked in nature with our friends without phones. And like we really need to return these simple actions to our lives.
Wow. Yes, that's amazing. It's so clear when you lay it out, TJ. It's so clear and it's not complicated.
And this is a very good foundational step to take. It doesn't mean suddenly anxiety turns off and disappears. Like some of our brains are just like more prone to those things. I do all this dose stuff. I still have my moments where my brain goes into fear, but it's really important to have smart responses to those moments so that you don't always utilize kind of sugar and phones and these kind of things to try and like numb the pain, but rather you respond in like a strategic way with connection or movement or nutrition or nature or whatever it might be.
Absolutely, because those other things that we do are actually taking us further down the wormhole. I mean, it's causing us more distress overall, even though we think it's like a Band-Aid and it doesn't really help. It takes us further back. So we're really not working on the problem at all. Well, I want everyone to know that it's all laid out beautifully in the book because it's a very usable book. It's understandable, can take actions right away, which is always something I like to leave people with. But before we close up, because this has been so helpful, I wanted to ask you if there's anything we didn't talk about that maybe you wanted to be sure that people know about. Beyond your book and your Instagram, I'm certainly going to send them there.
I think the only other action, particularly with this anxiety conversation, I'd love people to consider is this thing called the physiological sigh. I don't know if you've come across this.
Oh, yes, sigh. I do know it, but I'd love to have you explain it to them.
The physiological sigh is the idea of taking 2 strong inhalations through your nose and then a big exhalation. And when you look at a young toddler that's been crying, maybe you can remember back to being a toddler, maybe you have toddlers you engage with. When they've experienced quite a severe period of being upset about something, in their period of recovering, they start double breathing in and exhaling out. And obviously in that moment, they're not thinking, I'm going to do a physiological sigh. Their body is just naturally double breathing in and slowly breathing out. And for me, I live a lifestyle whereby I have moments that are really scary, going in on big podcasts and going on big stages with thousands of people watching. And my body can go into complete chaotic fear. And having it as a tool whereby every morning, if you were out on your walk in nature, that would be my goal for people, to be off the phone in the nature. If you could just sit on a bench for a couple minutes and you take a big inhalation through your nose and then another one and then a big exhalation. And even as you listen now, you could give it a go. A few rounds of that, but then doing it all the time. Like it's not like it's a hard, extensive thing to do. Is constantly sending a very clear message to your nervous system to settle itself. And our bodies are in fear. They're very confused by this crazy modern world we're living in. And if you can constantly send a nice message of comfort using that breathing method, it's very powerful. So double breath in, slow breath out, do it about 5 times and maybe do that once or twice a day. That would be a very useful thing for the body.
Oh, that would be lovely. Thank you for explaining that so well. Thank you.
No problem.
And so, everybody, I really hope you will go and get the dose effect. I'll have a link to that in the show notes. But I will also have a link to TJ's Instagram, and I highly recommend that you go there. I know you would do it on your phone or your computer, but it's very shareable, really little bite-sized bits of information that are beautifully highlighted. They're just done very well that you can share with your loved ones on Instagram so they can maybe begin thinking about these things also. TJ, it has been such a delight to have you with us. And I wish you great success with the book. Can you tell us when it will be available in the US?
Yeah, it's available on January the 21st. I'm not sure when you have this episode coming out. You can pre-order it before then if you would like to. And yeah, it's a very cool, clear guide. It takes you through the 4 chemicals, the actions to optimize them, and daily challenges you can complete. And I really believe anyone that reads it will experience a massive, massive shift in their experience in their mind.
I agree with you completely. Thank you again, TJ.
Thanks for having me on.
I'll be back in a few more days with another podcast. Until then, be well and aloha.